Hey, family, this is our opportunity, our platform. Let me say hello. How y'all doing? Welcome to another installment in what we call Relevant Conversations with me. I am Bishop John Solders, your host, and uh, I am pleased once again to be with you today, tonight, this afternoon, this morning, whenever it is that you watch and tune in to this, what I call podcast, where I get the opportunity to spend some time talking to some interesting folk. And once again, it has not failed. The divine has so ordered that we're going to talk to somebody that I find one, I actually like him. There are people you meet and you go like, they're interesting, and you keep it moving, right? This guy had the occasion to be invited to an event in his home. He and his wife hosted a group of us, and by the time I left the home, he handed me a book. Now, those of you who know me, you know books are a thing with me. I have a couple of them, and so, however, it is not always the case that somebody hands me a book that they have written, right? So that's a little. And I read the first page, couldn't put the book down. Had to order the book on Audible. I mean, I could not. I had to hear the whole story, and came to regard this brother and his work, quite frankly. Have now ventured to buy another book or two, and he is a very, very accomplished author. But I'll tell you, he's also a minister, and he serves in the Unitarian Universalist Association, and he is a minister and was a long time minister. He is the minister emeritus of First Church in Boston, the First Unitarian Universalist Church in Boston, and he's serving here in Connecticut with us, down in Hamden, and we'll be soon ending up his time there. He's been on a long interim. In my tradition, you serve about a year and it's about time to go. And we are getting to know each other and have grown pretty fond of him. The book he handed me was this book, 9 Days. It's a book he co-authored with his son, Paul. And the book is about Dr. King, the civil rights movement, the student protest movement, and the 1960 elections. So if that hasn't gotten your whistle already, let me invite our guest. He's married, has 3 kids. They're now adulting or trying to adult, and I happen to be one of those folk who has children who are adults, but they somehow still find their way in your pocketbook. They find their way, and you're constantly engaged in the investment of your children and your grandchildren and such. And he and his beloved are in the area, and it's just beats all get up. Here in Connecticut, you find all kinds of folk. Let me introduce to you the Reverend Dr. Stephen Kendrick. Come on into this platform, my friend and brother, and greet our people.
Hi, John. How are you?
All righty. I am good. How'd I do? I do all right? The intro okay?
I'm not a doctor, although I do play one on television. I'm just a plain old Rev, and was lucky enough to write books, not just with my son, but some other books on my own. But my chief duty in life is to try to be a decent father and husband, and be a good minister. But I've been able to write books along the side, and I've enjoyed that. And it's I've written a lot of books with my son on the intersection of culture and race in America, which is the tragic odyssey of our nation. And so we started off writing a book about the great desegregation case in Boston. I had just moved to Boston, and I realized that in my neighborhood was one of the great stories, hidden stories in American history, which was the family of the Roberts family, a young black family, a printer whose 7-year-old daughter, Sarah, was made to walk past 7 white schools and forced to go to a black school, which was completely, utterly inferior. And her father sued the city of Boston. And it went all the way up to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. And it was a really important moment in American history. And it was the one case that was listed when, the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So it ended up being a really important, but no one had ever really written about the family. And more importantly, we thought, my son and I are white historians, and we didn't feel that that was a story that we should appropriate. And we wanted to tell the story because it was an American story, but it was also about those people on Beacon Hill, the white and black allies who really did change America. And then we did another book on Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, and they met 3 times, and each time was a really important moment in the formation of the Civil War and who we are as Americans. And Douglass had a fantastic effect on Lincoln. I admire Lincoln more than any other president. I'm not alone in that. Lots of people do. But the more you learn about Lincoln, the more you realize that coming out of Illinois politics, he was far from a radical and was certainly not an abolitionist. And it took the violence of the Civil War to move him into a place where he could really become the emancipator that we all know and recognize. And also his meetings with Douglass were profound. And the more I learned about Frederick Douglass, the greater figure I found him to be. And then we realized that there was a third book in us. And I got to know a man named Harris Wofford, who actually was a senator from Pennsylvania. But what I was fascinated by, as a young man, he had been on the staff of the Kennedy campaign. And as I got to know Harris, I began to realize there was another hidden story in American history. And that was in October 1960. We have the phrase now, October surprise. This story, 9 Days, that Paul and I chose to write about, was really about this unbelievable and kind of hidden away tale of the arrest of Martin Luther King, who was at that time only 31 years old. And he was arrested 3 weeks before the Kennedy-Nixon election. And so, yes, we wrote about the student movement, and we wrote about King's staff and his family. But on the other hand, we thought it was also very important as historians to be careful, to mind our lane and try to figure out, well, who were the white protagonists in this story who really came to play? And the answer is yes, Richard Nixon, his staff, Kennedy, his brother, Robert Kennedy, and more importantly, the figures on his staff who really risked everything to try to free Martin Luther King from prison. This was the first time that Martin Luther King went to prison. We can talk more about the dynamics of that. And they really helped get King out of prison. And you and I were talking earlier today. where you were fascinated by the fact that when Martin Luther King went to Reedsville prison, and right before the election, it was when Daddy King and Coretta Scott King, they feared the most for King's life. They really did not think that he would ever get out of Reedsville prison. And so this story has a certain innate drama. And you know what? When King was sprung out of prison, was freed, the Nixon campaign had done nothing. Kennedy campaign, through a very complicated and complex story, which is part of the drama of what we want to capture, they really did help get King free. And it's estimated by historians that it shifted about 7% of the black vote. And this was an excruciatingly close election and would remain so until the day after the election. And historians feel that there's a good reason to suspect that Kennedy only won because of the action that this staff took. And so it's an amazing story. It's got a presidency at stake, and more importantly, the life of this young man. It's not the Martin Luther King that we all know. It's kind of an origin story, really, and we can talk more about that too. So those are the stories that Paul and I decided to try to capture, and we were well aware that in all the pain and difficulty and trauma and obtuseness of the relationship of black and white all through American history, there have been small moments, really opportune moments, where white and black could work together to some positive good. And we want to try to capture those stories, but not in any Pollyannish way, not in any sentimental way. We know how difficult the work is and how ultimately tragic the story is. But hey, as a minister, and I know you're a bishop, there's a sense of there's always hope.
Sure.
So we tried to find stories where there was hope and there was direction and there was a sense that we don't always have to live this way. Mm-hmm. We can try to envision a different way of our children knowing each other, of commonality, of that spiritual space where we're all children of God.
Yes.
And, so those are the stories that we tried to write, and yes, the newest book is called 9 Days.
9 days. So let me tell you. Let me tell you first what was gripping about this story. And those of us in the line of work we are in, I say this all the time. Dr. King is arguably the greatest preacher, that this country possibly has produced, and maybe throughout time, right? So certainly for those of us of a certain age, and the church universally, and here in the United States particularly, he may be one of the greatest American people. Never ran for political office, however, changed so much of what we know and live in today. So put that aside. At this moment, this is 1960. We only know Martin King really as the dude that led something or another that had something to do in Montgomery, right? We don't
Montgomery bus boycott,
right? So he's written his first book. By this point, he is also taking his first trip to Palestine, Israel. He came in through Lebanon. He has traveled a little bit and beginning to get a little notoriety because of the bus boycott. But this is not the civil rights leader we come to know. He's and I remind people all the time, Dr. King, he really had a short time of public ministry. We know him in 1955. And by 1968, he was assassinated. He was killed. 13 years.
Well, he dies at 39. If you ask a typical American, how old was Martin Luther King when he died? they imagined the statues and the gravitas and the voice, and they kind of imagined he was in his 50s or something. But
Right.
no, he was a really young man, and it was excruciating because I think he understood what he was giving up and
Sure.
how fragile his prospects were in racist
Sure.
America.
Yeah. So this is pre all of who we know, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. This was a
This is
young
not
man.
the king of Selma, not the
That's
king of
right.
the Millennium Campaign. It's not
That's
the
right.
king who went to Memphis, and certainly not the king that spoke in Washington. I have a dream. This is
That's
a
right.
really young. This is a very young man,
That's
and
right.
yet people are beginning to look at him as potentially an important figure. And the irony is, Daddy King endorsed Nixon.
But we're gonna get to that. Hold on for a second. We're gonna get to that because that's part of this drama, right? That I inherit because these are I'm a son of the black church. I'm a grandson. I'm a grand PK, right? So this is very up my lived reality in some ways. 1960. Here we are. This upstart is running for has garnered the nomination of the Democratic Party. This Yankee, this Catholic Irish Kennedy, this dude from Boston. He's garnered the Democratic Party's nomination. On the other side, the Republican nomination goes to the sitting vice president, Richard Milhouse Nixon. He's the vice president to the now retiring after 2 terms. We're still within the generation that remembered FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? And he was elected 4 times. We won't have that again, maybe. Anyway, but he served 4 terms, and we changed the law that only allows presidents to serve 2 consecutive terms, right? And 2 terms in general. And there may be a conversation about what that might mean. But anyway, and so it was understood that Richard Nixon was going to be the favorite. This was going to be a no-brainer. His predecessor, the Dwight D. Eisenhower, was loved in many ways. He was a very popular president. I ask people all the time, do you know how we got the interstate highway system? If you've paid attention at all, you'll see it says the Eisenhower system, right? Interstate system. Eisenhower was the guy. He was the general. He was the guy for World War II, right? He was the chief, and he saw how the Autobahn and how Hitler was able to move troops because of the Autobahn. That's Germany's highway system. And I think in many ways, he's like, put a note in. We need to move product and systems and troops and whatever we're moving in the United States in the same way. Up until the plan was set in motion to create the highway systems, we had these desperate, freeways or byways, or we didn't call them highways. I don't know what they would call that got you from one place to the other, but not necessarily to the next place and the next place. There wasn't a coordinated system. So Eisenhower was very important to business and commerce and the moving of goods and services vis-a-vis road. Of course, the train was also there, but the roads, and of course, after World War II, we have the proliferation of the automobile, right? And so you could go, white people could. Let me be very clear. Black people still, and others, we had some difficulty. But so I'm setting the stage, right? You know, historically, Dwight D. Eisenhower was popular. His vice president was running to succeed him, and we have this kid, this young person, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who was running against him. So that sets the kind of geopolitical national setting, right?
And it's a little trickier than that because Eisenhower was fairly popular among, black voters who could vote in the North, particularly. And so it's not the Kennedy that we know, because Kennedy was really viewed with great suspicion, I think, by a lot of black voters. And Nixon was perceived very sympathetically.
Mm-hmm.
And as a matter of fact, we write about Nixon, Vice President Nixon, meeting King for the first time at the celebration of Ghana's independence. And King went to Washington and met with Nixon in his office. And I think that King and his family was on the verge of considering Nixon to be a friend,
Mm-hmm.
certainly a political ally.
Mm-hmm.
And what we would discover is Kennedy and Nixon would shift in the course of the campaign very dramatically in terms of their relationship with the young Martin Luther King.
That's right. That's right. And you write very, you and your son Paul write very brilliantly over the distance of the book of how that shift occurs. Now, before we get into some of the major tectonic shifts, there were some players involved, and you and I, as we were talking earlier today, I celebrate that behind anybody that's doing anything, or typically a team of folk, unsung heroes, I'm going to call them, folk who are in one way or the other supportive of the work that's being done and lifting up these celebrated. You know, we tend to focus in on the celebrated one. You know, there's the one, right? We don't know, or we don't pay as much attention to the folks that are around the one, and even if they're not around, the folk that are doing that thing in particular cities and towns. I tell people all the time, as I've traveled, I'm a musician in my former life. I did some stuff, and so in traveling internationally, in particular, they would say, "Oh, you know, you got these great people," you know, and at the time I'm thinking about in the 1980s, there was a great celebration of the Detroit gospel musicians. All right, so there are a number of them celebrated, and they would write and hit records, and they were very popular. And they said, do you know this one and that one? And I said, yeah, but I need you to pause for a moment. Every major urban center in the United States has a series, have a number of these same kinds of people that you've never heard of before, who are writing hit records, and they're doing their thing, but they're not celebrated because they're not, lifted up in the same way. But Chicago, St. Louis, New York City, Philadelphia, DC, Indianapolis, you name an urban center, and there are the same people that Detroit had, or Kansas City, or the Bay Area, Los Angeles. So in the same way, you had that going on, I would suggest, in the work that Dr. King was involved in, for example. I mean, yes, and how in the world did a little town, the capital city of Alabama, become ground zero of what turned into a national and international global movement, right? Nobody was thinking about that when Mrs. Parks sat down on that bus, and refused to give up her seat. In fact, she wasn't the first to have done it in Montgomery, right? We come to know. So I remind people all the time that there's a whole system of folk. Mrs. Parks was trained. She was a member of the NAACP, and she was trained at the Highland Center. So we get Jim Lawson, and you can't talk about what was happening at the Highland Center and Jim Lawson in Nashville without Congressman Lewis and Diane Nash. Yeah. And James Bevel and all the whole cast of characters that come out of that. Bernard Lafayette, we were talking about him earlier. He was a part of those group of young people, and they were all teenagers.
They were so young. Yeah. King was 31, and the oldest figure we write about is Nixon, who's only 44. So the
hard to believe, right?
Are pretty young.
Yeah, right. These are all young folk. I remember Dr. King was 26 when he starts his public ministry there at Montgomery at Dexter Avenue Church. So, this is not a old people's movement. This was a youth movement, quite frankly.
It was, yeah. And I love the point you're trying to make about when you write a book like this. Obviously, in terms of merchandising it and selling it, people want to focus in on King. King is actually a fairly minor character in our book, and we don't really do that much with Jack Kennedy. We're mostly concerned with the people around King and the people around JFK and the people around Nixon, their staffs, and that's where you find the juicy people stuff. This is where the drama is. In history, yes, of course, we all have these major light figures who draw all the attention and all the charisma. But the reality is, as you and I were talking about earlier today, there are teams around everybody. And inside that team is the real story. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the story that you and I can identify with. I cannot really, truly identify with King. I can't. He was too talented and too charismatic. But I can identify with, an Andrew Young. And I certainly can identify with Harris Wofford or Sergeant Shriver or an amazing character. We felt like it was worth writing the book if only we could bring people's attention back to a guy named Louis Martin, mm-hmm. who actually was both in Detroit, and he was a Black journalist, and he became known as the godfather of Black politics. He was an advisor not only to Kennedy in the end, but also to Johnson, also to Carter. He was a real player. He was in the White House wing, not particularly written about in the history books, but he was enormously important. And he's a very important part of this story as well, because you can hardly come up with a case where Martin Luther King was sprung from Reidsville prison, which was one of the most deadly prisons in all of America. For a Black man to go into Reidsville, that was very serious business.
Yes.
And with Louis Martin on the case, it made a huge difference. Yeah. And these were the characters we wanted to bring to light because we thought, well, one, they'd been lost to history. And two, those are the kind of people that we can identify with. Those are the people, there's no good in writing a book unless at the end of it, you can say, there's something in that story that speaks to my story, that I can emulate, I can sympathize with, I can see myself within the story. And so writing about these characters meant all the world to us, and to be able to recover and recapture their story. Yes, of course, we have these major figures. The poignant thing, we interviewed Harris Wofford, and he was 89 when we first started interviewing him. And he actually died at the age of 92 on Martin Luther King Day.
Wow.
Just before the book was published. And so we would go to his apartment, and he would describe walking down to see the great statue that's now of King in Washington, D.C., which sort of looks across, ironically, paradoxically, to the Jefferson Memorial. Mm-hmm. And he would go there and he'd walk there and just look up at it and remember having been his friend, having known him, helping him make decisions, actually being a ghostwriter on his first book, and sorry, second book. And so to be able to really talk to Harris Wofford about the people that he'd met. Harris Wofford is the guy who binds together JFK and Martin Luther King. They only met a few times. They were not buddies. They were not friends. They were not even in sympathy with one another.
That's right.
But Harris Wofford somehow was able to work between them and for each of them. He was a part of each of their staffs and part of their lives. And so, again, we can look at a character like that or a character like Louis Martin and begin to see, oh, okay, history is made by people like us. Mm-hmm. It isn't just these major Napoleonic, fantastic figures. History is woven by a very complex tapestry. And that's, you paid me a great compliment when we met earlier today, because you said you did a lot of research. Mm-hmm. We did, because there are a lot of books about King. There aren't books about these other people.
No, they don't.
You had to work very hard.
Sure.
To court records, to find the oral histories, to interview them if they were still alive. And we worked very, very hard to get a kind of granular, literally day by day. The book's called 9 Days because it's 90% of the book is about a 9-day period where King is in 3 different prisons and before 2 different judges. Mm-hmm. And so again, this is a point where he was at the utmost peril, mm-hmm. and he wouldn't have gotten out without these other characters who weave through the story. And we also wrote about a guy named Frederick Morrow, who was
I was going to go to the other side now.
First Black staff member of any presidential administration. Mm-hmm. So he's a legit historical character, mm-hmm. and deserves memory and praise. He really wanted and believed that Nixon would do the best for his people, mm-hmm. and he desperately tried to get Nixon elected in 1960. And more importantly, he tried to get Martin Luther King out of jail. And he thought, because he understood that Nixon and King were friends, and as I was about to say earlier, Daddy King and a lot of the Black leaders in Atlanta were Republican. Why would they be Democratic when so many of the racist governors that they had to deal with on a daily basis were Democrats? So they were very sympathetic to the Republican Party. There was a Gallup poll taken 3 months before the election where the Black voters were evenly split between the Republican and the Democratic Party. So that's, again, a kind of a world we don't recognize, mm-hmm. because in the end, Nixon's evil genius came up with the Southern strategy. And so out of the goodness of this story, and I believe it is a hopeful and positive story, Nixon decides to create a Republican Party based on white supremacy and the Southern strategy. And so we'll never see a Republican Party like that again, I don't think.
I don't think so either. But so you're now right where I wanted to be in this conversation, because to tell this story, you have had to, one would have had to do some of the work to understand the Black community of that particular time down south, right? Down south, and let's be very clear. Daddy King, which we don't really know because of his son Martin King Jr., is so lifted and celebrated. But Martin, Michael King. All right, folk don't know that he was not born Martin Luther King. He was born Michael, and it was Daddy King that decided to rename himself and his son as Martin Luther.
Yeah, that's no pressure.
Right. Yeah. That's no pressure at all, right? Uh, and so he lifts him up in this midst. He was the player, the power mover and shaker. Daddy King was. Daddy King pastored uh, probably the most significant church in Atlanta, black church in Atlanta, and was a player. Daddy King, Martin's mom, so Dr. King's mother was in the family of the dynasty of black preachers who Daddy King succeeded. Right, so a couple of generations back, it was Mama King's grandfather who pastored Ebenezer Church. Right, so there's a lot going on here about black Southern movers and shakers, if you will, and what you do brilliantly, you and Paul do brilliantly in this book. You set up and you poise what was the establishment of an Atlanta. And I would say not only Atlanta, you got Atlanta is the major hub in Georgia, but you got Montgomery and Birmingham in Alabama. You got Jackson in Mississippi. You got Nashville and Memphis in Tennessee. You got Louisville in Kentucky. If we're talking about the South, right? You got Raleigh, Durham, in North Carolina, excuse me. In South Carolina, you got to talk about what's happening in Columbia, and of course, Florida, Jacksonville. You got to talk about Jacksonville. Or the people. I lived in Florida for a while. They call what is known as Miami. We call it Miami. For where I come from, black folk call it Miami. So in these towns, these cities, there was a great deal of support for the Republican Party at that time. Democrat, you just named it, the Dixiecrats were in charge. George Wallace was the governor of Alabama at the time.
People forget that he ran for the Democratic presidential nomination.
That's right, but he was some other, and he had a kinfolk in Georgia who was quite anti plenty of the things we would call justice oriented today. So this was a very different political moment. We were celebrating the wins coming out of Montgomery, the bus boycotts. There was starting to be a buzz. Dr. King's first book has got a little bit of traction. He now has made the move. He's left Dexter Avenue Church. He's come back to Atlanta to become co-pastor of Ebenezer Church. Daddy King was still pastor. Let me just be clear. Let's just be clear. Daddy King still was in charge.
And I think King appreciated that.
That's right.
he was kind of busy.
That's right. And they were trying to put together what we now know as SCLC. It was just beginning to become a thing, right? And so Dr. King was on the road trying to raise money in part, but also doing what some of I'm calling them the young lieutenants that began to gather around him. Ambassador Young, Andrew Young, and again, remember, this is before Jesse Lewis Jackson Sr. That we hadn't gotten to Jesse yet. Jesse didn't come on the scene in this crew until Selma.
Yeah.
Later, 4 or 5 years later. So here we are. There are two players, and you've named them, but I want to come back to them. There was a player who was really an operative in the Democratic Party. His name was Louis Martin, right?
Louis Martin.
There was a political operative in the Republican Party.
Frederick Moore. Yeah.
Frederick Moore. And I think these two guys were actually behind the scenes operating and maneuvering.
Yeah,
um,
you're right.
and we're speaking to their prospective crews, their folk, saying we better pay attention to this young man, King, in several different ways. You've already named that Dr. King had, in fact, met with I call him Tricky Dick. I'm sorry, it comes out of my mouth. met with Richard Milhouse Nixon, and kind of had, okay, all right, he's talking good, right? And let's be clear, the Kennedy campaign didn't give a rat's behind about, Dr. King for real. They wanted to stay away from this Southern racialized atmosphere down south. They didn't have much to do. And so while they had folk who said we need to pay attention, they're like, yeah, we can and they were really hands off much of this time. I mean, and I love what you in this book really dig into their kind of skittish behavior. I'm calling it skittish. I mean, they had all the political reasons why, and they were seeing it in the way they needed to see it, but they were not too inspired. And Martin had decided he was not going to speak. He wasn't going to wade into the national general election. Am I getting this right?
That's right. Well, I don't think he ever actually endorsed any candidate in his career. He did, in fact, quietly campaign for Democrats across his ministry, but he never formally endorsed anyone. Yeah.
Okay. And one of the things I know about this history is that what Dr. King's real gift was, and it was really through Daddy King and the network of Black Baptist preachers in urban America that actually helped. So anytime Martin King showed up in some town, there was at least one Baptist preacher he could go preach at, whose church he could go speak at. And that network of clergy and faith leaders, it wasn't a big network. There wasn't a lot of them. I often say, as many people that claim they marched on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, had they really marched on the bridge would have fell into the river. Right? So there wasn't a whole lot. And I can tell you, I grew up in St. Louis, and he didn't have too many friends. There were a couple. ICP was one of his friends at, I think it was Galilee Baptist Church in St. Louis. That was one of like 2 or 3 people he could actually go and speak to. And I asked my mother, I said, do you remember when Dr. King came to St. Louis? She said, yeah, I remember. I said, did you not want to go? She said, no, I didn't want no parts of it. I didn't want to have any parts of it. So it wasn't that even at his height, people kind of, stayed away in Black community. It wasn't everybody that was on the gravy train, right?
No, absolutely.
Right. And in particularly in these town cities, local politics ruled the day. And so Daddy King, in fact, you write about this in the book. There was a whole group of ministers and Black leaders that had already pretty much formed their opinions about who they were going to support.
Yeah.
Right. And that had to be calculated because whatever they were going to support nationally needed to then connect to the work that they were going to be doing in Atlanta, for example. So there was always the micro, the macro, then down to the micro, and then vice versa. There's this push and pull, and I'm very appreciative that you spent time framing that out a bit in this book. Now, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say that one of the great things is we got to sit down with the head of the Atlanta student movement, and he was just a lovely, lovely guy. And again, he was in his 90s, and we interviewed him the year before he died. And we felt like these young people were heroes because, as young as King was, these students were incredibly brave. And King had never spent a night in jail because he had an understanding that at that stage in 1960, for any black man to go into essentially a white jail was tantamount to a death sentence. And so that was not that was not a thing until these students rose up just in the same year, this election year, 1960. These students rose up and they did go to jail. And so they kind of forced King into going to a demonstration that he really wanted to avoid. He was actually going to go to Miami and do a speech with Kennedy, but he wanted to say that at the same time that he would also do an appearance with Nixon. And Nixon nixed it, and Kennedy canceled, and suddenly Martin Luther King, at this time period, 3 weeks before the election, was faced with the choice of really being cowardly. Should he go and get arrested with the students? And he decided, to his credit, that he would. And that's how he ended up in Reidsville prison. And because the students were all released, but these judges were most happy to have King in jail. And so it's a very complicated story about how he was freed. But he wasn't just a pawn. He had to make a very clear decision that he would go into prison. And that was not an easy decision for any sane person to make. He understood that he was toying with his life.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, in some of the newspaper research that we did, a young black man was killed, was knifed, the 3 days before King went into prison. And Daddy King was told by contacts he had in the Atlanta black community that there was a contract out on King, that if he went into prison, he would not ever emerge. Well, he would die on a sort of work patrol or in his bed late one night. There were plenty of knives and shivs inside the system. So, it was very brave of him to do that.
Yeah.
And so again, but again, the focus of the book isn't really about King, although he is the center. It's about all the characters around who also had to make desperate choices. And keep in mind, it isn't just the life of this young activist, although that's important enough. We would have not had the true Martin Luther King had he died at this stage.
That's right.
But it's about the presidency. The actual presidency turns on this set of events. And so we found it to be an amazing story. And we're just sorry that Steven Spielberg didn't buy it. We tried, we gave it our all. I think it would be a fantastic miniseries myself.
I do too. And I'll tell you, you got to buy the book and dig into this. There are a couple of different spots that I want to just point to. One, the student activists in the AU campus area. There was a young man who was kind of the leader of this the group. The protests and the actions that they were engaged in was to desegregate the department store downtown,
Rich's department store,
right? So that was the occasion for an action. Daddy King told Martin, "You shouldn't get involved. This is he didn't say quite beneath you, but I could hear a daddy tone on it. Martin, you got bigger fish to fry." And what you chronicle that I think is important was Dr. King's his own personal integrity. He had told these young people, these students, that if they planned or something, ran that plan past him one time, that he would support them. And that meant for the students and him, he would show up. Yeah. Right. And Daddy King was like, yeah, you told him that, but they didn't really believe. Yeah, there was all kind of wishing he would not get involved in this. So he then gets detained by the local Atlanta police. And then we get some funny gerrymandering of a different sort, courts and judges. Dr. King was ticketed for a whole nother thing in a whole nother county, in around greater Atlanta.
It was a $15 traffic violation. and he was sentenced to 6 months in work prison.
This is how he gets to prison. This is how, and just don't tell it. You got to read the book if you interested in. Got to read the book, but it is what happened in those series of misadventures of court proceedings that land Dr. King not only in prison, but then moved from jail to prison to another prison, and then we get to. That's where we get to Reedville.
And all the machinations to get the Kennedy staff, often against the advice of Robert Kennedy, the campaign manager, to do what was necessary to get him out.
That's right. That's right. And what I find interesting, if we fast forward to when Dr. King was assassinated, we had some of the same kind of carrying on, and the same players. You got Robert Kennedy, you got Richard Milhouse Nixon, who comes to Dr. King's funeral, but nobody knows he was there. They don't pay any attention to who is soon to become the elected president.
all the major characters of the book reconvene.
That's right.
Funeral. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Who were involved in this moment 8 years later, from 1960, when we get the rise of really JFK, right? He's killed by 1963, and then you got and what you all don't spend any time on, but I'd be fascinated. Here's a whole nother segment of research to do. Where was LBJ in all of this? And I'm sure you had to stumble along.
I had to track that down.
Yeah,
I think there are some indications that he was sympathetic to the notion of getting this young activist out of prison. Mm-hmm. But we couldn't actually come up with any specific documentation. Mm-hmm. But he was quietly sympathetic to it. Yes.
Yeah.
He didn't try to block it.
That's right. That's right. And he was the mover and shaker. See, what people also don't know, he was the leader of the Senate. But during the Eisenhower era times, yes. Right? And so and he ultimately joined the Kennedy ticket, for the purposes of winning and gaining the South. Quite frankly, he's the son of the South, Texas, right? So I find to know me, folk who know me know that political intrigue, palace intrigue is my jam. And so this has all of the makings of all that behind the scenes, the players who made calls, who didn't make a call, who should have made a call the week before, but didn't make it until after the week after, and all of that. You all document all of that. Ultimately, what we do know, history tells us that Dr. King was released and was able to rejoin his family. And I mean, literally within a few moments of the 1960 election. Now, many of us would say Chicago won the election for JFK, and there's several theories
about that politics. My son Paul has just been elected a state rep from the 12th district in downtown Chicago, and of course the Illinois statement is vote early and often.
That's right, and it doesn't matter if you're dead or not.
That's right.
It doesn't really matter. So there is some of that. The daily machine was in operation, and we know that. I mean, that's been pretty well documented. But what has not been pretty well documented is what the work that was done on the ground, not only in Atlanta, but all across urban southern United States.
It's possible the younger people have no clue of how close this election was.
Mhm,
It was astonishing. It
mhm,
was, talk about a nail biter. Uh,
mhm.
really, Kennedy didn't have any sense that he'd been elected until, about 8 o'clock the next morning. It was, I remember as a very, very young person, staying up late and watching. It's the first time that computers were ever used
Mhm,
counting votes. So it was an astonishing close election.
mhm.
And to be able to get some sense of at least one of the elements of how Kennedy became president was very exciting. It really
Mhm,
was.
mhm.
But at the heart of it is a young man named King. Yeah.
Yes, I appreciate so very much, brother Stephen, that you one gifted this to me, and you've told me you felt led to just share. And
Well, when you asked me to be part of the podcast, I wondered how would we ever fill up an hour? But it turns out that two ministers like talking.
that's right.
Apparently, we can talk all day. So
We can, and so one, thank you for the gift of the book.
thank you.
For all of the reasons I've said to you privately, now I've said to you public on this platform. It was a real joy because, in fact, it confirmed and affirmed what I know is true about how to get things done. It's not it's not the big moments. The big moments have their day, but it is the day-to-day grassroots, one-to-one, the organizing that happens behind the scenes, off the beaten path, that then makes the connections to the larger. It is always the micro and the macro having that they're having an exchange. There's
Helps us realize that we have a role to play.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It is fascinating stuff. Let me just post it. Let me just share it again. Here's the book. It is called 9 Days, and it chronicles the story of Dr. King. However, more importantly, the story of how a, a, a not so well known minister, faith leader, may have had significant contribution to a political campaign. What we do know at the end of the day, it is this same young man and his family and his team that changed America within about 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
Where he was just beginning to become somebody, a name recognized within a short period of time by the passing of both the Public Accommodations Act and then the Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65. We now Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King, is a household name, right? And we get from him by 67 his speech on Beyond Vietnam that he preaches in Riverside Church 1 year to the day of his eventual assassination in Memphis, Tennessee. And his linking, he was making another shift. If 1960 was the shift into the national political world, right, and the national, and I would say even broader than that, this what we have come to know as the civil rights leader,
Yeah.
right, of this nation and of the globe, quite frankly. Um, he was making another shift with the Poor People's Campaign that he also announced and began to work on in 1967. And yet, what he also didn't want to do, they announced the Poor People's Campaign December 1st, 1967, and within weeks they started to hear about the sanitation workers in Memphis. And within a few weeks, he decided we can't leave labor behind, and goes to Memphis in February, then leads a march. In fact, just a few days ago, um, 58 years ago, he leads an action, a march that goes way wrong, and decides I got to go back. We got to go back to Memphis and course correct and do it right. And that's why he was in Memphis, for that the work of linking labor and working conditions to the much larger context of what it means to be human, and what it means to be uh, um, a contributor into what it is we call this so-called democracy. As I've said to
Well,
you already,
as Franklin said, if you can keep it.
that's right.
I just wanted to say one quick thing. There's so many phrases that we can quote from King, but we were really struck by a statement that the Black Kennedy staffer Louis Martin came up with. At the end of his life, he said, "I never saw it as a job. I saw it as a lever to try to move this mountain of racism."
Hmm.
And we found that very affecting. And it's about people that got lost in history, but they were able to move mountains.
That's right. That's right, brother. Thank you very much for
Thank
saying
you.
yes, being with us tonight. Let me just say, as we close out, we are in Holy Week. So as we do this podcast, this is Holy Monday. And for those of us who are Jesus followers of Jesus, or Christians, this is a time of very sacred reflecting. If you are Jewish, this is also the week of Passover, right? What we call the Last Supper. Jews call the Seder meal. This week is a very, very powerful week. Dr. King would, within a week, on April 4th, be assassinated. You reminded me earlier when we were talking that it was right at the end of the Civil War, this time in the year. And in fact, Abraham Lincoln was killed right along in through here as well.
Right
Was
by,
assassinated.
yeah.
And so this is a very, very powerful spiritual time. We just ended Ramadan for our Muslim siblings. So I find this time to be a time of great spiritual reckoning and reasoning and sensing and feeling. And so let me commend you to whatever your traditions are. And if you don't have a tradition, um, the reason we use Dr. King's um, um, uh, um, at least the observance of his assassination, as a way to begin to think through and to think about what are we being called to, that is bigger and beyond just ourselves alone, and how do we gain, get involved, connect in some way to that which is bigger, that calls us, that somehow compels us or pulls us kicking and screaming sometimes into the struggle worth something bigger than just is me and mine. And I want to say this story has something for me to do with what that is. And I appreciate you very much for you and your son's commitment to the written word, but also your commitment to telling the stories of what happens when just ordinary everyday folk use their networks and start to maneuver. It doesn't happen just by happenstance. It happens
No, it
because
doesn't.
there's a commitment of folk who say, I think this is the way we need to go. And so I appreciate you very much for doing it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you,
And
John.
We will be back at it next week. Yeah, and I'm gonna say this already, speaking prophetically. Come join us again. We've got more to talk about. All righty. Thank you very much. We'll see you all. Peace.